Welcome to GTU. Thanks for joining us. As I understand this, my presentation will be a bit of a departure from the normal side. I am not a geologist, but we are going to talk today about aviation supporting mining sector and exploration. Good for the mining sector that Wilbur Wright was wrong about the helicopter. It's a necessary tool. We all know it and love it. So we've been talking about the realities of aviation management and the planning that goes into putting a project together. For the mining sector, and this specifically, we'll talk about the Golden Triangle. My name's Kevin Dawson. I'm the owner and founder of K. Dawson & Associates, Inc., which is an international aviation consulting firm. The last 15 years, we've worked primarily with the mining sector on 5 continents. The year was 1979 on northern Vancouver Island. There was a booming year for forestry. Logging was going crazy, and so too was reforestation. However, the nurseries were having an awful time getting enough seeds to plant trees, and it was what they call a plus tree, or plus year. So there was so many cones on the trees that year that they wanted more productivity. Typically, they would send out teams of people with small caliber rifles, 22s, and they would shoot down branches, and that's how they collected the cones. Well, a helicopter pilot, an engineer, and a young apprentice fresh out of school thought they'd come up with an idea. So they took the inner workings of a water bucket for firefighting. They took the inner workings out of it, put a floor in it, decided to put a person in the bucket with a chainsaw and some rope chokers, and they would hover up against the top of the tree. The person in the bucket would climb onto the tree, put a choker around it, and then cut the top of the tree off. And they would go and do that with, they had 9 chokers, and then they would fly in to a landing where they had local hires, and the hires would run in, unbell the ropes, and off they go again. So their production was phenomenal. And this was in October. They did 120 hours in 5 weeks. Totally illegal, totally unsafe. Transport Canada was on their heels. And I think, to my knowledge, I'm still the highest time bucket guy in the world. We never did get caught, we never got hurt, and I'm sticking with I didn't know any better. I was the young apprentice. So that's the beginning, and then I started my aviation and flying career, and it just so happens that the chief pilot came up to me one day and said, "We've got a job here, it's about 8 or 9 weeks in a tent camp. It's a diamond drill job. You'd be flying a drill and moving geologists around. It's in a cirque, 4,000 feet, and very steep, very few pads, mostly toe-ins. Are you up to it?" "Yes, always open for an adventure." He said, "It says here on the contract they want 1,200 hours. What have you got?" I said, 120. He looked at me and said, "What's a zero? The job's yours." So I scurried off, just excited as heck, scurried off to go find a pilot, a senior pilot, to tell me exactly what a drill was. What's a diamond drill? I had no idea. And I was off on my way, first job as a pilot engineer, ecstatic, until I got there, and very quickly I learned I didn't know how much I didn't know. It was a steep, steep learning curve. Understatement to say it was sheer survival. There was no proficiency, no efficiency, very little skill set, and luck got me through, and a very patient drill company. So my whole being has had to do with mining exploration from the get-go. Then I started to move up in the ranks and get more experience. And I was what they call a pool pilot, so I would float around to all the different bases, and one of them being Stewart, BC. And from Stewart, I began to fly in the Golden Triangle, doing all kinds of different work with geologists and drill companies. And it was a little ironic when we first started talking with GTU. I took a look back through my logbook, and while my initial entry into Stewart was in 1980, the 83, 84, 85 were very busy years. I was almost full-time operating in the Golden Triangle. In 83, I operated almost predominantly the whole season for Scotty Gold with a drilling and trenching program. And I do have my membership card. Doesn't everybody have one of those? You have to be hyderized into Glacier Inn in Hyder, Alaska, on the way up to the Golden Triangle. Anyways, I did run into a terrific cast of characters operating in Stewart and up the Golden Triangle. You get names like Big Ed, Bonus Nick, Trencher Jerry, Old John, all these personalities that were just fantastic to work with. Tons of characters up in that country. And in my logbook, I did look up, and one of the things that I had done was on the very close to the very end of the season in 1985, I was working with a geologist by the name of Norton Tribe, and we were in a small drill camp, 6 or 7 people, side of a lake, and he came up with the concept that he was convinced that they needed to drill the bottom of the lake. So we did the highest tech thing we could come up with. We got a bunch of rope and a rock, took the door off the helicopter, hovered out over the middle of the lake, and found out how deep the lake actually was. That was our high-tech maneuver. And that was Bruce Jack Lake. So the story continued on from there. As I carried on with my flying career, I did move up through the ranks and did the base manager thing, and then got into the mediums and heavy helicopters. I got going with helicopter logging in a big way, and we did a lot of firefighting and a lot of aerial construction work. So we would do things like ski towers and power lines and things like that. And it kind of put me in the mode where I was constantly working on remote site operations. And then I began to learn and absorb all that goes into these remote site operations for logistics and fuel, all the things that take place. So I was just living it more than anything else. Carried on to fly out the biggest machine that we have in Western Canada, being the Sky Crane. I'm a big Sikorsky fan. I really enjoy those aircraft. And again, this was predominantly for firefighting, helicopter logging, and then construction work. Then I got to a point where I actually knew what I was doing. And so I'd been around the block. I was sort of a co-manager of a helicopter logging operation. And then one day I get this call, okay, we need to go. It was Haida Gwaii, but it was Queen Charlotte Islands in the day. You need to go, and 2-day job, logging job, real easy, quickly get it done. And I said, is it all arranged? Is everything looked after? And they got, yes, sir, it's all looked after. Everything's taken care of. Well, here's a picture of me landing. I'm in the left seat, flying in the captain's seat. Looking at the engineer, we're looking at each other, and you can see the little painted rock barely beside the wheel. That indicates our landing spot. Well, it's below the high tide mark. So we're going to get tided out of our landing spot. And that's where the fuel tank was. So we really didn't have a lot of options. So what do? This is what they call a tow-in with a Sikorsky, where you're balancing the aircraft on 2 wheels while taking on fuel. Not legal, not safe, not remotely a good idea, but we were faced with one of those decisions. What are we going to do? Are we going to carry on or not? There's another shot, and there's me concentrating on holding the thing in the tow-in spot while we're taking on fuel. But what's ironic about this picture was that I was saying to myself, I know better. I really know better at this point. So that was actually the date and the time when I decided I was going to form a consulting company, because I do know better. I know how this stuff works, and this is not how it's supposed to work. But I can tell you that now because statute of limitations is well over, and so. And that's basically when I decided I would follow my dreams in the consulting world. This was my accomplishments as a pilot. I was very fortunate in terms of timing, where the opportunities just came to me and were available. So I was able to be a chief check pilot and Transport Canada approved pilot, and then ultimately led to becoming a chief pilot and operations manager. So I did get around, and I actually achieved all of my goals as a helicopter pilot, so I was quite happy to move on to the consulting role. We're going to talk a bit about emission profile analysis. It's what we call doing the work scope of the job and all the parts that have to come into play at the same time. So safety objectives, the environment, logistics, infrastructure, personnel, weather always is an aviation factor, and fuel. Personnel is really important in that training has to be undertaken. Everybody has to get some training for these types of operations. And the fundamentals of emission profile analysis are scalable. So one machine exploration operation to multitude of helicopters and fixed wing. So this is a fundamental. We're going to come back to it as we progress. My new consulting company, the easiest thing and the one that provided the immediate opportunity, was as a consultant to the Ministry of Forests of British Columbia. So when they had major forest fire campaigns, they would have me go out and organize their operations, oversee their operations, and in the off-season, I would develop training material and deliver the training material to their people. Basically, it's a matter of figuring out what's the right tool for the job. Sunday night dinner, roast beef, you got a penknife, carving knife, chainsaw. What are we going to do? We're going to mitigate the risk, and we actually want to eat today, so we're going to use the carving knife. But that's what it boils down to in the aviation management world, is what is the right tool for the job. So that was where I got the start as the consulting side of things. And first, we always identify the objectives. And one of the things that fell into place, again, is all these things are remote site operations. So it's a continuous sort of thing with me that just became second nature. Some of them are pretty astounding and pretty photogenic, really. This is a scene that I came across as I flew over the ridge going to, this was in Salmon Arm, British Columbia, I think mid-90s, and they, a massive fire, and it was threatening all kinds of homes and farms and everything else. The biggest issue that they had on my arrival was just on the other side of that fireball was the airport, and that's where all the aircraft were staged to operate fighting the fire. And they were about to lose the airport. So that was my first role to kick into gear, was to go elsewhere, find some farmland and design a helipad and get everybody staged, get the fuel put in, get their communications organized, and all the things that transpired. So that was, again, one of these remote site fixes. And all in support of what's the objective. So that always remains the constant. Back in the helicopter logging world, I was approached to help set up a new helicopter logging company. And I guess somewhere along the line with projects, you become a bit of a visionary where you picture how this is going to look and how it's going to end. So this company wanted to start helicopter logging, and so I found a hull for a Sikorsky S-61 that had been damaged down in South America, brought it up to, we did this work in the USA. And the hull was fine, it was fixed. We did what they called a shortening of it, so it's 58 inches shorter than the normal S-61, makes better design for the helicopter logging role. We then went and found another S61 in Aberdeen, Scotland that was used up. It was an offshore machine that had been servicing the oil rigs, but all the components were Timex. So we parked that machine beside the new machine, took off all the components, had them overhauled to 0 time, and then built a new helicopter, and off we went helicopter logging. Then I was talking about during the fire time, we had been doing work down in Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela, setting up firefighting programs. And I ended up speaking with the owner of a company that I knew had some Russian helicopters operating in El Salvador, because I wanted to use those machines to do technology transfer into Venezuela. So I was having a conversation with him, and then he said, "Do you know anything about helicopter logging?" Yeah, kind of have a pretty good idea. Well, he had this idea that he had a small machine, a Bell 205, operating in New Zealand, and the New Zealand group wanted to really try this helicopter logging with their natural hardwood. So we ended up making an arrangement where I would put together a program and set up a whole helicopter logging company and business in New Zealand, entailing the use of the aircraft coming from El Salvador. And again, it was one of those remote site things, but this one had a twist. There was 6 different nationalities involved. There was Kiwis, US, Russian tech reps for the aircraft, Nicaraguans, Salvadoran pilots. We could get into the country, but the Salvadorans wanted a back scratch, so we had to take some of their pilots. And then I provided the Canadian component of all the ground crews that were instructing and teaching the Kiwis how to do the helicopter logging and falling. So it was a very interesting episode. Now we move to Galore Creek. And for those of you and the viewers who may or may not have been up in the Golden Triangle, it is spectacular. It is stunning. It is beautiful. It's awe-inspiring. And there's something for everyone. It's an incredible place. And the glaciers everywhere. It's just a thing of beauty, postcard. From a helicopter operating perspective, it ranks as by far the most hostile, the most difficult in Canada for sure, and I would suggest it ranks up in the top 10 worldwide. It is harsh. It is high. It can be hot. It has ice, snow, rain, fog, everything within hours. It is just a brutal place for weather. And it's mountain flying at its best. You know, there's just all kinds of hazards and winds, and it's a challenge, true challenge. But if gold mining was easy, everybody'd be doing it. So look at the Golden Triangle, it's well named. But yeah, the weather changes so quickly. So this is in the middle of summer, and this was just a freak snowstorm that just plowed in, shut everything down for like 5 days. So the objectives that were given to us was, let's just build a mine. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It was Nova Gold Resources at the time, and they put together a team of specialists, again, from all over the world. And this construction team, mine construction team, had a lot of experience, a lot of depth, working in places like Papua New Guinea and Tanzania, throughout South America. They actually built the Musselwhite Mine in northern Ontario. So these guys were very, very experienced, but they never faced anything like this that did not have access. So this was a completely different thing. Through a roundabout way, I got invited to join the team as the aviation manager, and we had to really work closely together on putting this whole package together. So Nova Gold decided to try a 2-phase approach, and the first was a trial mobilization, and this was taking place in 2006. The trial mobilization, I know, was about me. Can this guy really do this? So they wanted to see, okay, you show us that this can be done. Nova Gold was a public company. I wouldn't blame them for wanting to give it a shot first. So we did. We we took that. But in the meantime, we had to start planning this, even for the small mobilization, the trial mobilization. We had a lot of planning to do just to get that to get started. So as I said, this was 2006. They picked an array of equipment that we would be using in the future. It was more of a, let's see if we can do this, and then we'll strategically use the equipment that we're going to fly. So it was a relatively small project. And yeah, got everybody used to actually slinging some parts, and they, as I say, they acquired a number of machines, and they were all shipped to Victoria. And there they started to disassemble the equipment, and the puzzle, as I call it, commences. So how are we going to take these apart? How are we going to make them so we can find our target weights? How are we going to sling them? Where are we going to put the hard points? What kind of sling gear are we going to use? We had to start working through all those questions. In the meantime, Nova Gold had been putting this whole project out about them building the mine. And this, with everything being flown in, had a lot of interest from a lot of different people. Well, one of the ones that came up was they had the insurers, Lloyd's of London, sent a team of underwriters over to Vancouver. My job was to give them a presentation of what my vision was of how this was going to take place. And I did, as best as I could. Like, this was only a vision. This is what we're thinking. And we put it together. In the end, one of the underwriters said, what do you think the odds are of you having a loss, like a damage of a loss? And I said, well, I guarantee you we're going to drop a load. With the amount of slinging that we're going to be doing, we will drop a load, I guarantee you. Well, they were stunned, of course. They're insurers. They're not supposed to hear that. But they thanked me for my honesty, and I said, well, I'm telling you, it's going to happen. So anyways, that was all part of the plan. But then we really had to get down to literally the nuts and bolts of how these things are going to come apart and how we're going to fly them in. We had to come up with, again, doing the whole assessment and the mission profile analysis. What is going to fly well? What is not going to fly well? Any helicopter pilot can tell you about flying plywood, doesn't fly well at all. So we had to go through all those types of things to see how things would fly. The biggest issue that we encountered, and this all came from the mechanics that were taking the machines apart, was how do we put it together? Here we're in a controlled environment, we've got compressors, resources, we've got all kinds of stuff that we can use. Out in the middle of nowhere, we have no idea what kind of ground we're going to be on, how we're going to actually put these machines back together. So that became the bigger exercise in taking them, in disassembling, was how are we going to reassemble? We got to make sure that we build different types of stands and things that will facilitate the building up of the equipment on arrival. So at this stage, of course, we're just getting ready to kick off, so we identify all the safety considerations. Mostly it was making sure that all the people that were going to be working in and around the helicopters were well trained, as load masters. Rigging points, so we had engineering involved. We had attempt to figure out the best way to sling amongst the lifting points. And then, as I said, we had to develop supports and stands and identify, protect against possible slinging damage. We actually had something that I missed, but it came relatively quickly. I think early on, when starting to fly some of these pieces of equipment, I was watching and see them take off, and everything was fine. I didn't see any rocks or anything flying around, but on arrival, they had broken window, missing window. And then it dawned on me, after the second time, that these machines are meant to go like 5 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, they're flying at 85 miles an hour. Well, the windows just pop up. So now we plywood over all the windows before anything flies. But little things like that you do go through, and you're going to get caught. Aircraft selection, as with any job, it really is. You go back to your objectives and see what we can use So in this case, we wanted to use the Boeing 107 Vertol. Key ingredient, which went through the entire phase of the project, was we had to make sure that we could have return fuel on the helicopter. We had fuel out at the Galore Creek site, but that's flown fuel, so it is hugely expensive. So all this heavy lift operation had to be organized and the weights calculated of the loads so that we would have return fuel there and back to Bob Quinn. The other one was the Boeing 234 Chinook, the heavier lift, 28,000 pounds max. We targeted 22,000 pounds because we wanted to have return fuel. Bit of a gas guzzler, but goes with the power. And at that time, I was very familiar with the operators in British Columbia, the heavy lift guys, and so I actually knew where they were working, and these machines were probably the closest in terms of the ferry cost to get it to the job site. So it wasn't that big of a job, the initial phase, but yeah, we had one reportable incident during this that was, well, they're always something that can be changed, but it just had to do with a number of sheets of corrugated metal that were too close to the landing area when the aircraft was putting its load down, and they took off. And no one was around, nobody got hit, but we took that as a resounding watch out. So the initial project budget for that first phase, we just, again, comes from a vision, comes from having a good feel for what the costs involved are. But I had predicted around $1 per pound was going to be our working number. The actuals. So the 107 only did 13 hours, 11 loads. The numbers are there. So we were pretty good on our average weight per turn. That worked out very well. On the 234, the average weight per turn was very good. One of the things that I had learned from my helicopter logging days was we would have aborts all the time, meaning that we were trying to pick up too much weight. We couldn't do it. The time wasted on aborts, it just astronomically increases the cost. So I made sure that we were not going to have any weight aborts. In this case, we did the weighing of the pieces before, once we took them apart in Victoria. So they were pre-weighed, we marked them, we knew exactly what everything weighed. And the loadmasters are hard at work. And we did a bunch of experimenting on this first phase, utilizing different types of parachutes and drogue chutes and things like that to help the loads fly a little quicker. So we started to get a little better educated at some of those things. And then we would use the right tool for the right job. We wouldn't use a big machine for small cleanup work. We got a Bell 205 in and just looked after that kind of thing. The staging area, again, this was a small operation. We just had a small area. It was no big deal. But again, this was just a trial. So that's what our staging area looked like. And the load risk management, as I said, we always were looking to protect all pieces. There's no sense in flying something out and then breaking it on its way out there. So we just made sure, very sure, that we were careful with what we did. That little machine ended up being just a real prize. That was one little machine that would help facilitate rebuilding all the other machines. So it was quite a funny little thing. Okay, phase 2 work scope. So this is the following year, 2007. We have been very busy with the management team in putting together hordes and hordes and hordes of information about what is going to take place. But basically, we were going to build 5 new camps in 5 different locations, with the concept being we would build the camps first, then the contractors, the road building contractors would go in, we would fly all their machines in, they would start road headings in 2 different directions from each camp. It was 120 kilometers in total. So we didn't want this to be a 14-year project, so we thought, okay, we start building from 2 directions at each camp, and that's the 5 different camps. 4.4 kilometer tunnel. This was done by a tunnel contractor out of Quebec. Over 70 bridges and creek crossings, 3 with spans over 200 meters. One of the bridges was a mega project on its own, let alone the rest of the project. Huge, huge, huge bridges. We had to build a main staging area, and we had the area located, but it was completely raw land, so we had to start from scratch. And then all contractors will ramp up as infrastructure develops. So, big key issue in the mission profile analysis, we had no infrastructure. We were building a camp right by the road near Bob Quinn. They called it the filter camp. And until that was finished, we had nowhere to stay. So no one could ramp up their personnel. So it was a very tough process, very frustrating process with no infrastructure. And then as it grew, we just kept every space that came available got filled immediately. So it was a very, very, very busy time. There's the Galore Creek camp, and here's one of the camps, the Porcupine Camp. Phaler Camp is down here, Round Lake Camp, and then the Moore Camp. Those are the 5 spots. They all, those were the camp locations where we had to build the new camps. And that was also, as you can see, one of the hindrances we had to deal with was the mountain goat habitat. Those are the yellow areas that are marked. And that was a bit of an issue in the beginning. We got it sorted out, but we did have to basically fly around those areas. This also shows that the frequency blasting. So what I had to do is I had to register the Galore helipad and with Transport Canada and Nav Canada, and then we had to do what's called a NOTAM, a Notice to Airmen, that basically almost shut down this airspace because of the frequency of activity and the amount of blasting that was taking place. So that's what the yellow line was for the area that Transport Canada and Nav Canada allocated to us to operate the project. Then we had to actually train the pilots on, okay, these are going to be all the mandatory call points. So as I said before, the weather goes terrible very quickly, and we wanted to ensure that everybody was on the same page as far as communications would go. So we had mandatory calling points for the pilots on their way outbound and inbound. Fleet composition. After taking a look at a lot of the equipment that needed to be flown and the amounts of fuel that needed to be flown, we needed some heavy helicopters. So we initially contracted 2 Boeing 234 Chinooks, 2 Boeing Vertol 107s, similar to what we had used the year before, 1 Kamov K-32, and 1 MIL Mi-26T. The Mi-26 comes from Russia. It's the largest helicopter in the world. Just happened to be operating or being in Canada that summer, and we went through a whole bunch of hoops and politics to enable us to get to utilize it, but we did. Then we had a squadron of medium helicopters with Bell 205 variants and Bell 212s, and another squadron of lights and intermediates. The lights were predominantly set up for really small jobs and medevac. So that was our medevac system for each camp. Plan. So we had to get to work, and as I mentioned, one of the things that comes up large is fuel. The fuel was an astronomical job to try to figure out just the diesel for supplying all those machines that are out in all these locations, and the number of enviro tanks that we had to put into place in all these places, and how soon we would have to refill them, how soon the trucks had to deliver to our staging area. It was that was just one part of it, but fuel, nothing goes without fuel. This was the means for moving fuel. They called them fuel pigs. They were originally designed by the U.S. military to be kicked out of the back of an airplane with a parachute, and or, as you can say, being cylindrical and having an axle, they were dragged behind a tank. But they worked well, and they were just constantly in the air. This is a snapshot of a Excel spreadsheet. As you can see at the bottom, there's all kinds of sheets for the entire job, the entire project. But this is just a quick indicator for one road contractor in the very near area. This is all for one laydown area, but all this equipment was going to go in. So there's D8s and D6s, excavators, and, you know, everything that's going to go in. And then each one of those had to be identified how we were going to take it apart and sling it. And just wanted to show you that this, from the same sheet, but this is from the fuel sheet, and it goes on for miles, and it just ramps up and up and up and up and up. So the more machinery that we put out on site, the more fuel we needed to produce and keep it moving. So these all went through. And I say with the bridge contractor, with 73 bridges and crossings, their list was enormous, just enormous. All those contractors then were bringing their equipment to site, to the staging area, once we got the staging area built. And then they were dismantling at that point. Then we had a system in place where each part would be weighed. We weren't going to have any aborts. So we had 2 cranes with calibrated scales. And then to put the final piece to the puzzle, we said, okay, we're going to have a 3 sign-off system. So the contractor that owned the equipment, the piece of equipment, would sign off the machine's ready to go flying. The helicopter operator, aircraft maintenance engineers, and loadmasters, they would sign off. So from the helicopter side, and then the contractor side, finally, one of my team members that was in charge of the heavy lift operation would sign off. So 3 signatures and a full weigh-in before anything took off. So this slide is identifies the aviation management team that I put together to oversee all aspects. So a lot of safety people, one of the key persons, I had a full-time person that was training, constantly training. So all the new people that were coming in, everyone needed to be briefed on being on board a helicopter, working around a helicopter. And then we had the more intense side of things where hover exit training had to take place, and then loadmaster. So we had continuous training taking place. We put together a transportation of dangerous goods. We actually had a visit from the Transport Canada dangerous goods people. They called him the man in black. He wasn't very friendly, but we survived. Dispatchers, we had dispatchers at every camp and heli-based personnel at every camp. At that time, my team registered around 33 people as part of the overall program of managing the aviation resources. This is what, at the planning stage, this is what our staging area was planned to look like. So at the far right, there's a big pad that is all off on its own. Well, that would be where the Mi-26 was. The downwash was phenomenal on that. And then the other heavies were across the top, and then the people moving segment was the 4 pads below. The heavy lift corridor was basically where all the heavy lifts took place, as well as the fuel. And each one of those segmented areas was for each contractor. So they'd have their own shops and their own mechanics working in there, taking apart and all the equipment that had to be flown. So we did have about 7 different contractors involved. The challenges that we had were like by the thousands, but the camp buildings, for instance, we knew that we had to have something. Number one, we knew the camp buildings wouldn't fly very quickly. So we calculated the fuel required on the Chinook, and we estimated the speed that they would be able to achieve would be about 40 knots. So we based the fuel burn on that, went back to the builder of the camp buildings, which I believe it was based in Kamloops. I went and visited them. We had to get them to make a number of their structural changes on how they built them to achieve the weight of 21,000 pounds. So that was very much a special order. And then I spent a lot of time working with the contractors for instance, as I say, a D10 cat, nobody's ever flown one before, so we got to figure out how we do that. A tunnel boring machine, I didn't even know what one looked like until I went to the Sandvik supplier in Montreal. Ore trucks, huge, huge, big trucks. And as I mentioned, the TDG regulators. One of the challenges from day one that I handed off to one of my very key employees that's still with me, Brandon is his name, and I said, Brandon, you are in charge of manifesting. We will not leave anyone out in the bush. That's your job. So from day one, when we started flying, and we're not talking eons ago, but we had no internet. We had nothing. So electronics were a waste of time. I gave him a clipboard. So you keep track of everybody that goes. And until we come up with a better system, that's what we have to do. But I was adamant, we just were not, there's so much going on, a lot of chaos, and but it was organized confusion, but I wanted to make sure we did not leave anybody out in the bush. That was a big thing with me. The humble beginning, this was our aviation operations building. This was the corner suite, and we were lucky to have that. That was the nerve center. There was 5 of us working out of there, and yeah, that was, we just had nothing. As I said, we had no infrastructure. We couldn't hire more people. We had nowhere for them to sleep. So we just sort of got by until we could go. This was a makeshift helipad because our main staging area wasn't built yet. So we still had to get started, but this was really not a good show. But it was what it was. We had to deal with what we had, and so we still kept it together. It was professional to the degree that it could be, but it was safe. That was the main thing, and I kept telling the pilots, I developed early on a pilot management system where I would say to the pilots, it's like day 2 on a forest fire. Communications are terrible, the radios are full all the time, you know, you just have so much going on. But I said, slow down. Just slow down. We've got a big project ahead of us. Nobody needs to be in a rush, so just take your time. And I also made a rule that it's so many aircraft in such a confined area that we just don't have any room for people losing their concentration. And if anybody has an incident, you're gone. You're going to go and take 2 weeks off, and that's all there is to it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. We just need everybody to be, we don't want fatigue to come into this at all. So we put that rule in place right from the get-go. Everybody understood it. I enacted it a number of times. And in fact, it got to a point where I'd be in my office and one of the pilots would walk in and say, I'm out of here. I just did this or did that, and whatever incident he had, and he just, okay, I'm out, I'm gone. Anyway, it worked, and it just kept everybody on their toes, and the idea wasn't to try to be an iron fist, but it was more a matter of anybody gets tired, just go, like leave. We don't want people here when they're tired. So anyway, that's the humble beginnings. And this was, as looking the other direction, you can see over here, there's our little Humble Beginnings Air Operations Center, and this is the filter camp that is being built. That's where we all were waiting for the infrastructure to be able to house people. The Mi-26 came with a crew of 17 people, so we had to time everything so that we actually had places for people to stay. All the machines. So there we go. Finally, we get into the business of building the other camps, and all our calculations had been well worthwhile. The camps flew about 45 knots, so we weren't very far off, and it was an easy lift for the machine with return fuel. Bing, we got it right. So they just went at it and started flying all day long. They would fly bunkhouses and kitchen houses and stuff like that, and they just kept going steady. And then it became more a matter of, again, with the infrastructure, the fellow that was in charge of putting together the construction of the foundations for those just didn't have enough people. So we kept running into blockages. And this is what the foundations were looking like. This is actually out at the Galore Creek camp. You might recognize the Grove crane that we flew out the year before in the trial process. Coming in handy. But this is the Galore camp. A little later on we'll have a shot of the transition. This was the staging areas, and of course, being that we were in the spring and the snow was slow to melt, it became a mud bog, so we ended up bringing all these rig mats for them to land on, and it worked out very, very well. Each of the companies brought their own little maintenance shop and for the heavy lift machines, and they just set up shop on their own, and we supplied the fuel, and away we went. Constant safety briefings, always on the go. A lot of ground crews, always with the number of people moving that we ramped up to. So we had, it's a construction site, the entire project. So it was mandatory to have all kinds of safety briefings, tailgate briefings. We had, even at the peak of all the flying, we shut down all the helicopters on a Sunday morning, brought everybody into air ops not that little air ops, but the new air ops, where we had a big briefing. And so we had about a 2.5 hour briefing every Sunday about what had taken place during the week and what was going to take place the following week, as well as we'd have guest speakers. So lots of times it would be the environmental people that were saying, okay, this is this, and the goat ladies, we called them, that they would come in and tell us how the goats are faring with us trying to fly around the environmental zones, etc. But it was constant. And then the MI6 showed up, and things started to get real. Now we're going to start really moving some heavy iron, as they say. And that was just a look in the back of the thing. It was cavernous. You couldn't believe how big it is. Anyway, that's the machine, again, with the rig mats. And that was our air ops now. So we moved from the tent. That was my office on the left, the big meeting room in the middle, and then the admin and the dispatchers were down at the far end. And yeah, we had a great view of the actual staging area, and that was the nerve center for the entire project. This is what the staging area actually materialized to be. So we have, down here we have these are the camp bunkhouses ready to fly, waiting for their foundations. This was a heavy pad for the Chinook. This was a heavy pad for the Boeing Vertol 107. KA-32 was down here. And then up here is where all the 205s and the hot fuel pad was down here. We always hot fueled the machines because we did not have enough pads. So we just hot fueled them and got them out of there. But this would be the staging, the muster area down here for all the personnel, and this was air ops. That was my building. These are all the contractors with all their equipment, and at this point we're starting to get to the point where we're starting to fly a bunch of their equipment. Constant flow inbound of equipment because we didn't have enough room. So we had to time everybody to be bringing their equipment in according to a schedule. Dancing Vertols. So yeah, there was quite a ballet actually. One of the people that came up and did some documentary filming, they actually called it a bit of a dance. So one would be lifting off, the other would be landing. I mean, it was just constant movement. How do you fly a grader? That's how you fly a grader. So 44,000 pounds was the maximum lift for that machine. And it had power to spare. I remember watching the first lift it did, and it was 42,000 pounds. And he got it off the ground probably about 8 or 10 feet and really wasn't going anywhere. And I was starting to think maybe it's just a bit too much because most helicopters would start trying to get moving to get flying. He wasn't doing that at all. So it turned out, so I learned after the fact, they were calibrating their weigh system, onboard weigh system. And so once they finished that calibration, they had this thing, poof, he just took off, just gone. And I couldn't believe the amount of power. So, yeah, flying a grader was not an issue if you had boards on the windows. The boys having a little coffee break up at, this is at Galore. Still trying to put together, again, Galore needed the bedding as badly as we did back on the filter camp because we needed to start the tunnel. The tunnel was going to take a long time, so we really needed to get the tunnel guys put in place. More moving, constantly moving. This is now how you fly a D-10 Cat. So we figured it out. But, sorry, you could see the stands that we had to build for it. This was powder mags. There was so much blasting going on, we were flying powder mags all over the place. And they would be put out at these road sites where they had to start doing a bunch of blasting, and then they would call to get them moved to the next location. These river crossings and creek crossings, we had just reams of this type of equipment that we constantly flew out. This was all part of falling under the bridge contractor's perspective, and there was all kinds of interesting things that came up. In some of the road areas, the environmentalists taught us the lesson, but we had to build little mini tunnels for toad tunnels, we called them, and it was just part of the environmental process of allowing them to go under the road. But yeah, so this was all part of the bridge contractors' responsibility, and I just can't stress enough, fuel, 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 fuel. This is actually out at one of the camps, I think it was Round Lake, that the weather would change, we would get snow, thus the light that would be sticking up out of the snow so they could see where the fuel tank and the fuel pump actually was to try and get some fuel for the machines. This is a good view of the camp building in process, and this is again out at Galore Creek. You could see the new buildings all have not yet got the winter roof on top, but that's showing you the expansion. This, of course, is a new bridge being put in place. So this is what the bridge builders and the contractors would be doing back at staging, and they would fly the chunks of the bridge directly out and place them in sight with the helicopter. The transition. So this is what the exploration camp looks like. This one, I think, was at Svaler. And then this is what Galore Creek ended up looking like as things progressed and we got more and more. The tunnel area is actually just in the top right of the photograph there. And this is how Galore Camp looks pretty much today. And what would a big helicopter project be without some frequent visits from Transport Canada? They did want to come in. It was exciting. They wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to see what was going on. So, and we welcomed them. It was actually good to see support for a big aviation project like this from Transport Canada. Here's an overview of what took place. Total flight hours for all the helicopters, just over 17,000 hours in a 9-month period. We did 56 million pounds of heavy lift loads. Total lifts 2,200. One dropped load, and that one load happened to be an ambulance. And it happened to be an ambulance landing in a creek with all the chemicals and stuff in the back of the ambulance. So, yeah, and it was a rigging issue. It was really unfortunate because we'd had a clean run, but I knew it would happen, and one happened. 5 drop loads from the lights and intermediates, typical. And then estimated, this is where we really got busy with the people moving. So we had people movements to work sites every day of 380 to 400 people. Throughout the course of the day, we would have specialists, whether it be guys with special tickets or people with special tickets that had to do a propane hookup or some kind of electrical thing or something, or engineers had to go out and examine something, or geologists. And so we were constantly moving people all throughout the day. And what I found was the little jet rangers were becoming taxi cabs, and really expensive taxi cabs. And I kept joking up there saying, well, we just need to get a bunch of doormen at each camp, and yeah, we'll just call it New York. There's like taxi cabs going everywhere. So we decided then we would take a Bell 205, and we called it the bus. And it started at the filter camp, and it stopped at every camp on the way to Galore, and it turned around and it would come all the way back, stop at every camp. All day long the bus was running. And we would just tell the people, no more Jet Rangers, get on the bus. And that's what they did. So we were moving about 150 people a day just on that. So basically, yeah, we were getting close to 500, 550 people movements per day. And we still had the mandate, we're not leaving anybody out there. So we had a big check-in system with all the dispatchers at each camp so that everybody was accounted for at the end of the day. Brandon likes to tell a story that when I gave him that responsibility, he took it and he made sure that he was diligent with it and everything else, but he actually went one better. He actually came in +1. So a guy that turned out was kind of on the run from the police ended up out in the middle of the bush in like no man's land and saw these helicopters. I guess he finally scared himself enough. He found himself out and lost, and he sees these helicopters and he can see which one's going full and which way they're coming empty. So by this time he's down to one shoe, and it's still cold at night, and he hikes and he's following the helicopters. Well, finally he staggers into the staging area. And immediately everybody knew Brandon's the guy for people. Like, where'd this guy come from? And the first words were, and I got a call immediately from the project manager. What's going on? Like, how long has this guy been lost? And no, he was +1. So we actually gained one out of that whole project. So, and then the poor dispatchers were saddled with having to open and close the airspace for every blasts that were taking place over the flight line. And that was occurred 1,100 times during that 9-month period. Our peak jet fuel utilization was 100,000 liters per day. And so we'd be trained a day. And then we were moving far more than that in fuel per day for the diesel. But we were burning a lot of jet fuel. There's a lot of hours being flown. So those are pretty staggering statistics for a 7-month or 9-month period. We ended up with, 17 to 18 machines was our typical run when we would have additional requirements for, we still even had an exploration program going on in the middle of all that. And one other thing that we did have, Nova Gold was in the middle of fighting off a hostile takeover from Barrick at that time. Barrick had a small claim that was inside the boundaries of that, and they decided they were going to put a machine in and do a little drilling just to ruffle the feathers at Nova Gold. Well, it didn't take very long, and I ended up having to go to court and say that this was a safety hazard and everything else, or they have to be part of our team and part of our briefing and on our frequencies and everything. Sure enough, we won, and this guy, the poor guy that was out on that job, just loved coming into our briefings. He wanted to be part of that team. He didn't want to be out there by himself. So anyways, I got, once you're a helicopter pilot, you kind of got to get a kick out of the Mi-26. It's a pretty amazing machine, so I enjoyed it. Okay, so we're going to circle back to a discussion about the mission profile analysis. And as always, it begins with safety. So on your operation, whether it be a small one-machine exploration project or larger multi-aircraft, it always begins with safety. What are your safety standards? What are your company policies? The experience levels that you require, not 120 hours first job. Specific aircraft configuration, do you need any type of radio, etc.? What are your policies regarding hot refuel? All these things come into play. The aircraft needs to be suitable for a medevac. We always want to have the medevac coverage. We want to know that if we do have a problem and we have to send the aircraft out on a medevac, if that's the only aircraft we have, are we shut down? Do we stop? Does everything stop? What do we have to do in that interim? Training. I'm big on training. General field personnel for basic safety, advanced training for hover exit, specialized rigging, slinging, pad building is always a big one, clearances. So all these things that need to be part and parcel of establishing how you're going to achieve your objective. Okay, and then as far as the aircraft type selection, this is where you take a look at the very realistic evaluation of the site environment. And as we spoke about earlier on, the environment at Galore Creek is brutal. It's harsh. Everywhere where you're at the base of a glacier, you're going to experience subsiding air. It is going to be difficult to get lift. So you have to take all these into consideration, the elevation, the temperature, all these things, the extreme high temperature. Aircraft, some aircraft are very suitable, some are not in high and hot type of operations. We call that density altitude operation. And what exactly is required? Is it a long line drill support? Will the machine be required to hover out of ground effect or not? Accurate low weights. All these things have to be examined for any size of operation. Just a very quick story. I took a machine, a Sikorsky S61, down on fires, and we were down in Montana. And there's jurisdictions down there, so either federal, state, or BLM, Business Bureau of Land Management. And they govern where you actually go to get your water with your bucket. So they sent us off and they gave us the coordinates, and sure enough, a cirque up at 7,000 feet, and it's stinking hot, and we're in this Sikorsky that's designed to fly offshore at 3,000 feet. Anyway, we get up there, and we had a normal thing. We were both captains, and we would swap seats every fuel cycle. But the co-pilot, the signal to the captain, he would tap on the collective. You could feel it on the other side. So he'd tap on the collective when you're reaching your maximum power and temperature limits. So we're in this cirque, in this Sikorsky. I'm getting the tap, and I look down, and the long line is slack. Like the bucket's in the water, but we're not able to hold ourselves there, let alone take a bucket of water. So we ended up having to go back and forth and slingshot this bucket, try to get it just to the shore so we could launch the thing out. So we spent about 45 minutes fighting, because I wasn't going to pickle the line and pickle the bucket up there. Not happening, not on my watch. But in the meantime, while we're fighting away up there, there's this guy coming up in what was called a llama, and it was like a 1950s design, French machine, but it was a powerhouse in the hot and high elevations. This guy's coming in, grabbing his bucket, going back, grabbing his bucket, going back. And then we started giving us the gears on the radio. How you doing? How's it going? So he flew circles around us. The machine was not the right machine for that job. It was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So again, now I know better. When someone says, oh yeah, just go there for water. Anyway, so duty day implications, all these things come into play when you're examining what's required to achieve your objectives. Ultimately, when you do it right, you find that safety and efficiency go hand in hand. They work together. If you're doing it properly, chances are you're doing it in the most efficient manner with the most efficient aircraft and people. Okay, that's supposed to say thank you, but I missed part of it. And that's the end of the show. That's my show. All right.